Welcome to the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast, Episode 6, Introduction to Data Integration Patterns. Thank you for joining me on the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Smith, the Dynamics Mechanic. This is the Dynamics 365 Strategy Podcast, where we discuss implementing software systems using the Microsoft Business Applications Platform. It's where I give you the strategies and teach you the techniques I learned in my experience as a delivery architect at Microsoft.
This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And KingswaySoft now fully works with CDS and Power Apps.
In this episode, I want to talk about data integration strategies, and there are different ways that we can manage data when it comes to how we position that data to be used by Dynamics, whether you're in an on-prem or an online situation. A lot of times you'll find that when the concept of running a dynamic system online comes up, a lot of technical architects or even sometimes non-technical business stakeholders will ultimately ask about, where the data is going to live. And it really depends on the requirements. But the thing that you have to remember is there's like 10 ways to solve any particular kind of problem. So let's just kind of go over a couple scenarios where I've kind of looked at a problem and how I kind of saw a solution, or at least a solution that I thought was maybe better than others. So for example, I had one customer where they have a system in online, but then they have this other specialized app that is used to aggregate some data from some other data sources and kind of show it in a certain way for a call center. And part of the problem is that this customer was pushing a lot of data up into Dynamics from other systems as a way to aggregate some of that data. And unfortunately, just the way that the data is shaped in Dynamics, it's not fast to query that data in that format. And this is an application that has a very particular speed necessity. As people are on the phone with customers, obviously, if you've ever had to experience that and you're sitting there and the customer service person's like, "Oh, sorry, my computer's slow right now." Like, okay, like if you're calling and you're already irritated about something and they say that, it's like, "Oh, you guys," anyway, you can architect your system in such a way that, for example, in this particular case, I suggested that we don't try to query the data directly out of Dynamics from this web application. Instead, one of the architecture techniques that I like to use is a proxy cache, right? In this case, the website would instead consume a web API, right? And from the perspective of the web app, it doesn't care where the data is coming from. It just knows that, hey, I should call this web API, and that's my one source of truth. I don't have to worry about where all the potential aggregates of data are coming from. And that kind of makes the architecture of that website more simple, and it should be a little bit easier to maintain. Now, when it comes to Azure, we can use something like an API app for this. But basically what we're doing is we're creating a proxy in front of this web app. And then what we can do is we can have the code in this API basically use something like Cosmos DB. Hey, if you haven't checked out Cosmos DB, it just blows my mind. But anyway, we'll have a discussion about that in another episode. But what you could do is this API basically says, hey, let me check my Cosmos DB cache and see if I have this information that is being requested. And if it's not in the cache, then it could go to Dynamics, and it could go to other places to aggregate the data in such a way that it can service the request. Now, maybe the first request does take a little bit longer because it's actually querying data sources directly. But then what it can do is it can store that information and cache it in the Cosmos DB database. And then the next time someone has that query, we get it out of the cache. Now, granted, there are other things to consider in this pattern. For example, what are the business requirements as far as the freshness of the data? What's the timeout? Is it 5 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it a day? I mean, a lot of back-end systems for enterprise customers are still running batch. So a lot of times you can get away with only refreshing the data once a day, which is great, especially when you're caching information and you don't have to keep querying, the actual data sources directly. But another thing, like I talked about with the replication of data to Dynamics, this is something that a lot of customers will do out of the fact that it's just easier to query the data if it's already in Dynamics. But when you're dealing with large data sets, it's just not ideal to sit there and have like an SSIS package just hurling, millions of rows of data up to Dynamics, especially if the data changes quite frequently, right? Now you're just trucking. Now you can write your package such that it only sends updates and changes. But if that data set does change quite a bit, you could be pushing a significant amount of data on a regular basis, and it feels wrong. It's kind of like an architecture smell instead of a code smell. It's kind of an architecture smell. It depends on how the data is being used in the system and how the users interact with it. So, for example, I had a conversation with a customer, and they were asking, basically, when does it make sense to replicate data into Dynamics as opposed to querying that data directly from the data source that's on-prem? Another question is, what's the data volume that you're dealing with, and what's the velocity, and what's the time sensitivity of that data? And that gets back to what I was saying is, depending on the business requirements, the timeliness of the data may be a really hard requirement to meet. So, for example, if we were talking about like stock market data, which updates like constantly, a couple times a second, let's say, trying to cache that data obviously in Dynamics and keep it up to date would be a ridiculous feat. So when you have a situation like that, it actually makes more sense to set up a mechanism to query that data directly from the source, as opposed to trying to replicate it and partition it into Dynamics or even into a SQL Azure database. This is where one of the patterns where I try to avoid it, because I don't like having to deal with the security team and setting up firewall rules and all that, because they don't like to do that. But in a case like this, it's kind of hard to not do that. So what I would like to do in that kind of case is set up, typically the security team will want like some kind of VPN set up between Azure and the on-prem data center, or even something like ExpressRoute, where there's basically a private connection that's not just willy-nilly going over the internet. Even though, all of our communications are, encrypted using HTTP going over the internet, the security teams just like to have, stuff like that with like the VPN and all that. So typically what I try to do is either have a web service call down through this VPN connection to on-prem. So there's one thing I don't like about that particular pattern is the fact that, let's say a user performs action A in Dynamics, which requires data from a on-prem system. Dynamics then calls this API, which then communicates through the VPN tunnel to the on-prem asset, gets the data goes back, and then it goes to the user. This is a very long trip to make. If there's a lot of that going on, if there's like a high load scenario, I don't really feel like that is feasible, because having to basically make the double hop is really hard. So I would it depends on the scenario. Ideally, I would like to try to have the user be able to query that data directly from the client. And hey, sometimes you just can't do that. But that is another way where, sometimes customers will have, for example, a VPN client that they install on their users' laptops. And they can tunnel in that way if they don't want to, say, for example, open up a port on their firewall and allow people to query, make calls that way. The other way to handle this or the way I like to handle it, is with that proxy cache pattern, where maybe we have this on-prem asset that has a piece of information. This is excluding the real-time data scenario. But I like to have my data sit in the same data center as my CRM instance. If there's like external data that it needs to query, I don't like Dynamics trying to query anything on-prem directly, like by, for example, setting up a firewall rule, and then maybe you have some kind of application gateway that forwards the request to the proper server, which then maybe has an underlying database behind. There's so many points of failure in that. But if you can set up a proxy cache where you have this web service or whatever in Azure, and it has a backend database behind it, like SQL Azure or Cosmos DB, then Dynamics doesn't have to be concerned about where it's calling. It's just calling this one thing, and it kind of aggregates. And this is kind of where the API app, I think, can really make sense in this kind of scenario, where you have this one kind of unified API interface that Dynamics will speak to, but underneath you can actually have several other kind of back-end APIs that are being utilized to serve up the data, and Dynamics never has to know where it's actually coming from. But by storing data in Azure as necessary and caching it there, then it doesn't have to always go to on-prem and make those round trips. Another scenario question you might ask is the synchronization of the data one-way or two-way? And you basically need to ask is the data read-only, or can it be updated by the system? Now, this changes the equation a little bit, obviously, because if you're dealing with a two-way synchronization, it may make more sense to just keep that data in Dynamics as opposed to putting it outside of Dynamics. Virtual entities, for example, right now does not support updating records. It's only a read-only thing. Depending on the volume and depending on how that data is actually used in Dynamics, if it's, for example, related to a record that has some kind of value inside the system, you may have to replicate that data into Dynamics and keep it up to date. If it's part of a business transaction that it's maybe reference data or directly correlated to some kind of customer activity. As far as direct query guidelines or guidelines that you can go by for figuring out if you should leave the data somewhere else and just kind of query it as needed, is how big is the volume of data that we're talking about? Is it 1,000 rows? Is it a couple 100,000? Is it in the millions? And that really will kind of help shape the question, because if we're dealing with just a huge amount of data, it really starts to not make sense to put it in Dynamics, because not only is replicating that data going to be a little bit heavier, the fact is the cost of storing data in Dynamics is just going to be like 20 times more than other options like blob storage, right? Or the SQL database or Cosmos DB. It's just they've made it to where the data in Dynamics is at a premium, and so we just need to treat it with a little more care as to how we actually go about using the data. And the other thing, like I mentioned, is the rate of change in this data high, or does it change so often that it will be very difficult to keep Dynamics up to date? And if that's the case, then that kind of lends itself towards direct querying as opposed to partitioning the data into the system. And that gets back to the requirement of staleness. Is it real-time data? Is it hourly? Is it daily? Is it weekly? If it's not real-time, or even if it's hourly, a lot of times the system can keep up with something that's hourly, but if it's real-time, that's just usually a no-go. And the other question is the data used more for reference? If it's just like a piece of information that's in the system somewhere that maybe is occasionally used or is maybe queried in some kind of business automation, it kind of lends itself to maybe you can move it outside of Dynamics and not have to keep it inside. When it comes to integration strategies, there's several ways we can go about kind of thinking about how we tailor the data and where it lives. The partitioning strategy is basically where you take a set of data and you chuck it up into your dynamic system, whether it's on-prem or online. And that's the easiest way to go. It's a quick, well, not quick, but you write an SSIS package and you point it at your data set and you say, hey, put it in Dynamics, and there you go. The consequence of that is, for the ease of implementation, you pay for it in just the storage in your Dynamics database and the effort to keep that data up to date, which, if you're dealing with small data sets, maybe that's not a big deal, but as they get bigger, it's a little more challenging. The direct strategy, which for an on-prem system, you can use a web app, for example, and have Dynamics query that web app, and you can have the web app, depending on how you're doing your stuff, you can have that web app exposed through a firewall or not. If you're on-prem, you can also have clients that are using VPN, tunnels into your network, and then maybe, if you have like client-side stuff trying to query data, they would need to have that VPN connection set such that they can actually reach things or assets that are behind the firewall. You can also have Azure hosted assets like a web app that basically will be the interface that Dynamics can speak to. And that web app, a web app, basically you can iframe it into your Dynamics. If you wanted to have a web API, Dynamics could consume that from Azure and kind of encapsulate and obfuscate the necessity of the data that needs to be queried to satisfy the request. And maybe some of those pieces of data need to come from on-prem, and this web app or web API can handle or broker that exchange such that Dynamics doesn't have to know where the data is coming from. The last option here I have listed is basically through the use of virtual entities, which is a fairly new official feature. It's something that was actually possible using retrieve plugins before, but the Dynamics product team decided to make it an actual bona fide feature, which I think is good. The only challenge there is that any web API that you create has to conform to OData specifications, and it does have to be formatted in such a way that the virtual entity can query it. So, for example, you do need to have a GUID as a record ID. So if you're querying, for example, a customer list and the ID for customers is an integer, you're going to have to finagle that a little bit just to make it compatible for using with a virtual entity. But I would definitely say when it comes to virtual entities, be very careful that you're not trying to query on-prem assets directly from a Dynamics Online system through a virtual entity, because it's setting you up for some bad things to happen, especially if any kind of business logic written may inadvertently start querying that virtual entity in mass. You're just setting. It's just not a good thing. Let's just not even go there, right? If you're going to use a virtual entity, I would definitely say whatever data source that it's querying, it should be in the same locale or same data center as your CRM server, just to make sure that you minimize the points of failure, but also you try to ensure that anything querying that virtual entity is not going to sit there and hang, especially in enterprise class systems where you may have, tens of thousands of users. You just have to be really super careful on how you go about using virtual entities, but it's definitely a great tool that I look forward to using more in the future. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. Feel free to reach out and connect with me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen Smith CRM, and that's STEPHAN. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Stephen Smith CRM as well. And feel free to check out my website, and that's dynamicsmechanics.com. Thank you.